Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Technical video, we're going to be continuing part 2 of our discussion of a recent interview with the Xbox One architects. Now, these guys have been trying to tell us why they made the decisions they made with the Xbox One, and the internet has literally gone crazy. I mean, I read a couple of message boards, I don't really post on them, but sweet geez, people have been going to town on these guys, and Eurogamer as well, actually, for the interview. And we're going to be going into part 2 on this, which is going to continue with the importance of the CPU and GPU compute. They start off by saying Sony was actually agreeing with us. They said their system was balanced for 14 CUs. Out of quote just for a second, that's the GCN units, also known as compute units inside the GPUs. They use the term balance. Balance is so important in terms of the actual efficient design. Their additional 4 CUs are very beneficial with their CPU and with their additional GPU could work. We've taken a very different tact on this. The experiment we did showed that we had headroom on CUs as well. In terms of balance, we did the index more in terms of CUs than what we needed. We had with CU overhead. There is room in our title to grow over time in terms of CU utilization. Then they pointed out to the skeletal system in Connect, Exemplar, and they said Exemplar, ironically, doesn't need much ALU. It's much more about the latency you have in terms of memory fetch. So it's kind of a natural evolution for us. It's like, okay, it's a memory system which is more important for some particular GPU workloads. Okay. The internet went to town on these guys when they said the word balance, because here's the problem with balance. If I was to construct a Voodoo 2 system with a Pentium 2, 64 megabytes of RAM, that system's balanced, right? If I was to build an i5 with SLI Titans and let's go with 8 gigs of RAM, it's not as balanced, maybe, let's go with, as the Voodoo 2 system, but it's a hell of a lot more powerful. In other words, saying balance doesn't mean anything, and this has created tons of memes on the internet. I mean, you guys could check them out. There's even some on redgamingtech.com, Facebook, so you can go to facebook.com/redgamingtech, and it's ridiculous. I mean, people are even saying, well, balance, the system can't even stand up on its own. And here's the problem when you're saying such arbitrary statements. It doesn't mean anything. It's like, for example, I could say that I've had a number of dates with Kate Beckinsale. I could say that I've had a number of dates with Kate Beckinsale. The problem is, the number would be 0. You see the problem there? It's like, it's a meaningless statement. What does balanced mean? For example, Sony originally had 14 compute units. This was the leaks. I don't know why they changed it or what period they changed it, but Mark Cerny did agree that they did originally at some point or another have this set up. They had 14 compute units, and then they had another 4 that were dedicated to just doing stuff like physics and so on. Then they said, you know what, this isn't going to work, we're going to change it, and we're going to give the developers 18 to do whatever the hell they want with, but we're going to counter that by beefing up the queue length for compute and volatile bit and other bits and pieces as well. In other words, they had already balanced the system around the fact that they had 176 gigabytes of memory bandwidth. Now, for those of you who are not that familiar with graphics cards, for example, on the PC, the Xbox One and PS4 are both using the same architecture as the 7970s/Southern Islands. There's very little difference between the Sea Islands and so on. But effectively, they're pretty much very similar on the same architecture, the same GCN architecture. And as it turns out, the 7970, just for example, uses a 384-bit memory interface. Now that gives you about 264 gigabytes per second, if I remember correctly, memory bandwidth. And that's with 32 compute units. So if you translate that to the PS4 and you start scaling it down, you actually turn out the PS4 per compute unit actually has slightly more memory bandwidth. But of course that's not reality, because then you've still got to factoring in, say, CPU usage of the bandwidth and whatever else. But regardless, it's roughly in the kind of ballpark that you'd expect. Now, as for the memory latency that Microsoft continues to state, DDR3, for example, hasn't got that much more memory, hasn't got that much of a latency improvement over GDDR5. So the only benefit that I can see is the ESRAM. I'm still not exactly sold on that, however. It's still a little bit early, I suppose, to tell, but still, let's work forward on the interview just for a moment. And they were talking about the speed boost. Now, for those of you who are uninitiated, and I'm fairly sure that Sony at this point hasn't confirmed the clock speed of the PS4, there was some stuff mentioned on the PSSL slides that I was discussing earlier. I still need to do part 2 of those, where they said that it was 1.6 gigahertz. So you can assume that it's going to be 1.6, but it's not been 100% confirmed yet. But let's assume that it is 1.6 versus Microsoft's 1.75. Now, that's definitely an improvement. Some people have said it's meaningless. I mean, I've seen some people say that, you know, the clock speed increase on the AMD Jaguar is nothing. It's pointless. It's, you know, completely meaningless. And I said at the time, I disagree. I think it's very good that Microsoft did manage to increase the clock speed, and let's hear from the team. Interestingly, the biggest source of frame rate drops actually came from the CPU, not the GPU. Adding the margin to the CPU, we actually had titles that were losing frames largely because the CPU bound in terms of the core threads. In providing what looked like a very little boost, it actually a significant win for us in making sure that you got steady frame rates on the consoles. We've got a lot of CPU offload going on. We've got Shape, the more efficient command processor relative to the standard design. We've got a clock boost. It's going to be a large part to actually ensure that we've got headroom for the frame rates. Imagine you've rendered to a depth buffer in ESRAM, and now you're switching to another depth buffer. You may want to go and pull what is now a texture into DDR so that you can texture it out later. You're not going to do tons of reads and writes from the textures, so it actually makes more sense to do it in DDR. So you use the move block to move these things asynchronously in concert with the CPU, so the GPU isn't spending any time on the move. You've got DMA, Direct Memory Access Engine, doing it, so the CPU can go on and immediately work on the next render target rather than simply moving bits around. We've done things on the GPU side as well as the hardware overlays to ensure more consistent frame rates. We've added 2 independent layers so you can give to the titles where one could be 3D content and one could be the HUD. We have a higher quality scale than what we have in the 360. What that does is actually allow us to change the scale of the parameters on a frame by frame basis. Okay, the interview continues for a few more minutes, but let's do a little bit of analysis on this first, as you'd expect. Okay, so I actually do like, as I said, the fact that that Microsoft have given the CPU boost, right? Because we're fairly aware that the AMD Jaguar is not exactly amazing in terms of performance. It's a low-power device. It has, of course, 8 cores, but 1 to 2 of those are being utilized for system. So let's talk about the data move engines. Basically what they're saying is that rather than utilizing either the GPU or CPU to move a piece of data, let's assume that you have something that's in ESRAM and it doesn't need to be written to for a while, right? Or read for a while, should I say. So it's better to put that in DDR because you have slower access to that, right? So what's basically going to happen is that it moves it from the ESRAM. Now it's been textured, and it wants to now put it in DDR. So either the GPU/CPU could do this, or the move engines will do this. Now the move engines are basically fixed function processors. So the theory is, from what we understand, that you won't need to really worry too much. In other words, it's going to do the work for you as a games developer. Now, this actually can free up CPU and GPU cycles. Now, let's talk about Shape for just a moment. Now, it can actually run 512 simultaneously simultaneous voices for game audio, and it can also do, for example, speech processing for Kinect and much more. It's actually a custom audio block. They designed it in-house, and it's based on 4 DSP cores and several programmable processing engines. Now, it's extremely powerful, and I actually did an analysis of this already if you want to check it out. But some people might say, well, who cares? It's audio, what's that going to do? Reality of the matter is, we do know from games developers that the Xbox 360 CPU got pillaged by audio code, with a whole thread being actually taken up in some cases just in processing the audio. So it could be a really big thing. So that's very good. The problem is we're not exactly sure how it compares to the PS4s, because obviously a lot of this stuff is going to also be put to the Kinect. Obviously, the Kinect is going to be utilizing a lot of this stuff. So what the hell does it mean when it's saying about change the scalar parameters on a frame-by-frame basis? Basically, the idea here is that it's dynamic resolution. So in theory, as, say, the game becomes busier, to maintain a set frame rate, a certain frame rate, whatever that is, let's say the developers are targeting, let's say 30, just to make it easy. Let's say that they, on average, want the game to run at 1080p, 30 frames per second. What they would do is vastly simplifying this, but effectively, they would write a bit of code, and if the game became busy, rather than rendering natively at 1080p, it might render at, say, 900p or 720p, just for example, which obviously puts a lot less strain on the GPU, and then the upscaler will, upscale it, and obviously it will do a fairly reasonable job. We know, for example, Rise, Son of Rome is running apparently at 900p. Forza, for example, is running at 1080p. So, in that respect, I can see it. Obviously, people are already taking this apart and saying, well, that means the Xbox One's not going to run at 1080p. The thing is, here's my counter to that, and this might sound a bit defensive to Microsoft, but here's the thing. People are already stating, the Xbox One's not going to run at 1080p. Okay, I'll grant you that from what I'm reading, the Xbox One is going to be weaker in terms of the GPU, and I understand that, and I accept that. I'm not defending Microsoft. I don't really care which console's more powerful, to be honest, but that's just me. But here's the thing. The PlayStation 4 is going to run into the same issue eventually, because it's a fixed device. You can't just say, I'm going to improve the graphics card in this thing. You can't just mosey on to your local store, get a new graphics card, stick it into the PS4. And so as developers want to start pushing higher frame rates, or they want to start doing something else, we're going to start seeing instances of the resolution dropping and them needing to do things like use the scaler. So I don't really think that this is a major thing. I think it's good that you can use dynamic resolution scaling. It wouldn't really matter how powerful the GPU is, whether it was, 12 compute units, 24 compute units, a billion compute units. Eventually you're going to hit, well, maybe not a billion, that probably render in real life, but you get the idea. Reality of the matter is there's only a finite amount of computing power that these consoles have. Yes, from what I'm understanding, the Xbox One will definitely hit that wall faster, but the dynamic thing is quite nice regardless. They also said I talked about CPU glitches causing frame glitches. GPU workloads tend to be more coherent frame to frame. There doesn't tend to be big spikes where you get the CPU, so you can adapt to that. What we're seeing in titles adopting the notion of dynamic resolution scaling to avoid glitching frame rates. As they start getting into areas where they started to hit on the margin where they could potentially go to a frame budget, they start dynamically scaling it back on the resolution so they can keep their HUD in terms of true resolution, and the 3D content is squeezing. Again, from the aspect of the gamer, I'd rather see consistent frame rates and squeezing on the number of pixels than have frame rate glitches. So obviously that's just stating that the heads-up display, the Xbox 360's, the Xbox One's HUD, where you've got all the various bits and pieces, that'll be cool. The actual game heads-up display, same thing, that'll remain 1080p, but the characters and whatever else, of course, will be downscaled. From a power efficiency standpoint as well, fixed function are much more friendly on fixed function units. Are much more power friendly on fixed function units. We put data compression on there as well. So we have LZ compression, /decompression, and also motion and JPEG decode, which helps with connect. So there's a lot more to the move engines than just moving one block of memory to another. In other words, their theory right now is that, well, it could do multiple things. Now, a lot of this is very handy because obviously the Connect sensor is going to be doing things like, for example, randomly taking images or, sensing your movement and so on. So live chat, for example, a lot of the purpose behind all of this is just so that you don't notice any slowdown. I actually don't mind the fixed function accelerators. I think they have their purpose. The GPU/CPU and everything else, of course, do have limits. It's quite interesting that they're saying about clock speed, the clock speed of the CPU. For example, the developers of Resogun, which of course is the platform exclusive for the PlayStation 4, have said that they're hitting about 50% utilization for the CPU. They're using a lot of stuff. They're farming off onto compute. I hasten to add, of course, that is not the same type of game as something like Battlefield or Rise or Forza. In other words, we're not exactly sure how that's going to translate. Now, if we're comparing this to something like Killzone Shadowfall, and obviously this is, a very small demo, so they might have changed it. You can see the CPU utilization. I have done an article on this. You can Google Red Gaming Tech Shadowfall and you'll come right up. And I've also got it on the channel and the website, so you can easily find it regardless. And you could see that the CPU utilization is actually pretty high. However, in their own documentation, Guerrilla's own documentation, they said, and I quote, "The biggest performance challenge was thread contention, shared memory allocator, tons of mutexes. We gained approximately 50% of CPU back by fixing high-level code." So we're not even talking about low-level stuff here. We're talking about like high-level stuff, and it's a bit interesting because they've also said that we had a few fights with the PS4's thread scheduler, and a lot of the SPU code used spin locks. They also said do this first before you try to switch to some low-level multi-thread friendly malloc. So in other words, they're saying, worry about the high-level stuff, get your house in order there, and then go from to the more low-level optimizations. In other words, work on the easiest stuff first, and that makes some sense. I'm not exactly sure, however, from the perspective of the future, how this is going to go. Now, remember, the Killzone Shadowfall, and we're only using this because we have oodles of information about Shadowfall. They were using one use for the GPU compute. They were using it for, I believe it was memory defragmentation, which isn't exactly like, all the uses. It's not like they were using it for physics or for AI or something more traditional that you'd, expect to also see bundled in there. And so, obviously, that will start getting CPU usage down. I'm interested to see just how that's going to go. It's very interesting. 50% usage. I think that Microsoft did do a good thing with the increased CPU usage of the increased CPU speed. I'm not necessarily on the fence that, it's going to make a massive difference. It's roughly, 10%-ish performance increase. Well, a smidgen under. But you know what? I'd rather have it. Some people have already started to bring up the points on the forums I'm going to, and, the general consensus of messages I'm getting. Well, can the PlayStation 4 make up for this because of its better compute? The answer is probably. This is going to be one of those situations where the Xbox One might do better to begin with, until developers start getting more used to piling stuff onto compute. I guess it's just going to be a matter of just sitting there and kind of waiting. Tools right now are really early on, which isn't exactly ideal. We don't really have an abundance of technology. So anyway, it's about 20 odd minutes, which is a pretty good place, I think, to call this particular video. I'm going to be continuing this tomorrow, where I'm going to be giving my final thoughts and analysis on these guys and giving my kind of final opinions on their interview anyway. There's still a lot more to talk about with the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. It seems that there's always that little bit more information that slowly creeps in. I would really like it if there was a bit more of an honest discussion. There's a lot of questions that I'd like to have answered, actually. One of the big ones is it's okay. Like, anyone can say, well, okay, the developers are used to this. Okay, that's nice. But how is it going to compare to a huge pool of RAM? Those are the questions that I want to know. And how I'm reading the interview is it still requires the developers to actually utilize this memory and do a lot of optimizations. And if I was a games developer, I wouldn't really be a fan of that. When it's kind of like, okay, I could do it, I'm not lazy, I want to make the best game possible, so I have no choice. But at the same time, it's like there's this other platform that just makes it so easy in comparison. I think Microsoft have made a series of good decisions, but also a series of really baffling ones, and I'm not exactly sure that I agree with a lot of them. We do know that, for example, Killzone, they're focused their optimizations on going, I quote, wide. Almost all code is multi-thread / jobified. Makes sense. They have done no low-level CPU optimizations at all. That's what Guerrilla have said for Killzone. I'd like to point this out, however, before we go and close this off. When they're saying about going wide, they talk about putting it over as many cores as possible. In their breakdown, that's showing 6. Microsoft have a good opportunity maybe with the CPU side of things. I'm unsure where they're going with it with the GPU side of things. And in terms of the memory, I don't like the ESRAM so far. We're going to be closing this off on a final thoughts and analysis and kind of a point video where I'm going to be discussing a few of the mysteries surrounding the Xbox One that just are really up in the air right now. So that'll be like the final part of this series anyway. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Do let me know. I don't usually read the comments, so if you want to get hold of me, just go to facebook.com/redgamingtech and you can stalk away, my good friends. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.